Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. Jonathan Whittaker had just returned to his apartment in London when he found a mysterious letter at his doorstep. There was no sender's name, just a thick, yellowed envelope that looked decades old. A wax seal on the back bore the words, Blackwood Manor, Northern Scotland. He carefully opened the letter. The handwriting, written in faded red ink, had seeped into the aged paper, as if time itself had tried to erase it. The message was brief yet strangely compelling. If you seek the truth long forgotten, come to Blackwood Manor. The answers the world has been searching for lie within. Jonathan was an investigative journalist with a passion for uncovering supernatural mysteries. His work had been featured in major magazines, often covering eerie places believed to be haunted. But this invitation felt different, like someone knew exactly what fascinated him and was leading him to something no one else had ever uncovered. Blackwood Manor wasn't unfamiliar to him. He had read about it before, a centuries-old castle in the Scottish Highlands, rumored to be one of the most haunted places in Europe. Stories spoke of vanished residents, ghostly cries at night, and a spectral woman in white seen standing at the upper windows, gazing into the surrounding forest. If this was real, it could be the greatest story of his career. Yet, beneath his excitement, an unease lingered. 2 days later, Jonathan rented a car and drove north. The roads became increasingly desolate, winding through rolling hills shrouded in mist. He glanced at his GPS. According to the map, he should have already reached the last village before Blackwood Manor. But the road seemed endless, looping turns, identical trees, a sense of déjà vu creeping over him. Just as he considered pulling over to check his route, something struck his windshield. A massive raven slammed against the glass with a loud thud, its wings flailing before disappearing into the fog. Jonathan slammed on the brakes, his breath ragged. But when he looked ahead, there was no bird. No feathers. No trace of impact. Checking his rearview mirror, he froze. Through the mist, a figure stood at the side of the road. A woman in white, her form barely visible through the thick fog. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Jonathan finally arrived at a small village, the last settlement before Blackwood Manor. The place was eerily quiet, with stone houses that looked hundreds of years old. There were no streetlights, only the occasional glow from windows. He parked in front of the only lodging that seemed operational, the Hollow Inn. Its walls were made of weathered gray stone, and its windows were fogged despite the relatively mild air outside. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and damp earth. An elderly woman named Margaret greeted him at the counter, her sharp gaze scrutinizing him. When he mentioned his destination, Blackwood Manor, her expression darkened. Her lips thinned, and her hands trembled slightly as she handed him the key. She gave him a single warning, do not leave after sunset. Jonathan merely nodded, accustomed to local superstitions. He had heard such warnings before in countless haunted locations. That night, Jonathan felt uneasy. The room was colder than expected, despite the windows being shut. A draft whispered through the room, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the forest outside. He lay on the bed, trying to sleep early so he could head to the castle first thing in the morning. But just as he began drifting off, a sound made his eyes snap open. A tapping at the window. It started faint, then grew louder. Sitting up, he peered at the glass. There was nothing outside, only the silhouette of trees swaying in the wind. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something even more unsettling. The small mirror on the bedside table, which had been clean earlier, was now fogged over. And on its surface, a message had appeared as if traced by an unseen hand. Do not go to Blackwood. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, trying to shake the creeping dread. It had to be a coincidence, just moisture forming patterns on the glass. But the longer he stared, the less logical it seemed. He forced himself to lie back down, yet sleep refused to come. The hours dragged on until, finally, exhaustion pulled him into a restless slumber. Then something woke him. A whisper. Soft. Faint. Almost impossible to pinpoint. He turned toward the window. And there, just beyond the glass, stood a woman in white. Her long hair obscured most of her face, but he could see her eyes. Empty. Hollow. Staring directly at him. His pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to move, but his body felt paralyzed, pinned by an unseen force. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. Jonathan jolted awake, gasping for breath. He glanced at his watch, 3:15 a.m. For a moment, he tried to convince himself it had all been a dream. But when he turned back to the window, the latch that had been firmly locked was now wide open. And drifting into the room was the overpowering scent of jasmine. The next morning, Jonathan woke up to an eerie silence. The usual sounds of birds or distant village life were absent. Only the slow creaking of wooden beams above his head reminded him that the world outside still existed. He sat up, rubbing his temples. The events of the previous night lingered in his mind. The woman at the window, the open latch, the scent of jasmine, it all felt too real to be a dream. Checking his phone, he noticed something strange. The battery had drained completely overnight, despite being fully charged before he slept. He reached for his notebook, flipping to the last page where he had scribbled down the warning from the mirror. But the page was blank. He frowned. Did he imagine it all? Had his exhaustion twisted his mind into seeing things that weren't there? Shaking off the unease, he packed his bag and made his way downstairs. Margaret, the innkeeper, was already waiting at the counter. She barely acknowledged him, but as he passed by, she muttered just loud enough for him to hear. "If you hear the bells, turn back." Jonathan paused, glancing at her. But before he could ask what she meant, she disappeared into the kitchen, leaving him alone in the dimly lit lobby. Outside, the morning mist still clung to the air as he started the car. His destination was just a few miles away. Blackwood Manor awaited. The road leading to Blackwood Manor was nothing more than a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for his car. Tall, ancient trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches intertwining like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. As he drove deeper into the woods, a peculiar sensation crept over him. The road seemed untouched. No tire tracks, no fallen leaves disturbed, as if no one had passed this way in years. Then, he saw it. A rusted iron gate, partially open, with an old stone arch marking the entrance to the manor grounds. The words, Blackwood Manor, were barely visible beneath the moss and decay. Jonathan parked the car just outside and stepped into the cold, damp air. As he approached the gate, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, distant sound. Bells. Somewhere in the distance, a slow, solemn toll echoed through the trees. He hesitated, remembering Margaret's warning. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Steeling himself, he stepped through the gate. Blackwood Manor stood before him, a towering relic of the past, its Gothic spires piercing the grey sky. The once grand structure was now a decayed shell, with ivy crawling over its stone walls and windows darkened by time. As he moved closer, he noticed something unsettling. Despite its state of disrepair, the front door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for him. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and damp fabric. Dust particles swirled in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its wooden banister worn smooth by the touch of countless hands over the centuries. But the strangest thing was the silence. A place this large should creak, should groan under its own weight. Yet, there was nothing. Not even the sound of his own breathing. Jonathan moved cautiously through the manor, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He found himself in a long corridor lined with old paintings, portraits of Blackwood's past residents. The faces stared at him with hollow eyes, each subject frozen in an expression that seemed almost aware. As he walked past them, a chill ran down his spine. One of the portraits caught his attention. A woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading down her shoulders. She looked exactly like the figure he had seen at his window. Heart pounding, he stepped closer. The nameplate beneath the painting was too worn to read, but something about her gaze sent a shiver through him. Then, in the silence, he heard it. A whisper. Not from the painting, but from behind him. Slow. Deliberate. A single word. Leave. Jonathan spun around, his flashlight darting across the hallway. Nothing. Only shadows stretching unnaturally across the wooden floor. Forcing himself to stay calm, he took a step back. But as he did, the air shifted, thick, heavy, charged with something unseen. The portraits along the hallway seemed darker now, their expressions subtly changed. Then, he saw it. A shadow. Not his own. It was standing at the end of the hallway, featureless yet undeniably human in shape. It didn't move, didn't breathe. But it was watching. Jonathan swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight tighter. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his feet refused to obey. Then, in the space of a single blink, the shadow was gone. But the air remained heavy, the silence deafening. Jonathan exhaled shakily. Whatever was in this house, it knew he was here. And it was waiting. Jonathan forced himself to move, stepping away from the hallway of portraits. His breath was shallow, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. He needed to stay rational. Hallucinations weren't uncommon in places like this, dark, abandoned, filled with the weight of history. He continued down the corridor, eventually finding himself in what appeared to be a study. The room smelled of aged parchment and damp wood, with towering bookshelves lining the walls. A massive oak desk sat in the center, its surface covered in dust, except for one thing. A candle. It stood upright in an ornate holder, the wax melted and hardened at its base. But what unsettled him most wasn't the candle itself. It was the fresh wick, burning with a steady flame. Someone had lit it. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He had seen no signs of anyone else in the manor. Had the innkeeper been wrong? Was someone still living here? The thought barely settled before something changed. The candle's flame flickered violently, as if an unseen force had passed through the room. The temperature plummeted. His breath clouded in front of him. Then, from behind him, came the unmistakable sound of a chair creaking. As if someone, or something, had just sat down. Jonathan turned slowly, his flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing moved. But the feeling of being watched clung to him like damp air. His gaze landed on the bookshelves. Most of the tomes were old, their spines cracked with age. But one book stood out. It was pristine. No dust, no signs of age. The title, written in gold lettering, sent a chill through him. The Lost History of Blackwood Manor. With hesitant fingers, he pulled it from the shelf. The book was heavier than expected, its leather cover strangely warm to the touch. He opened it, flipping through brittle pages filled with names, dates, and accounts of those who had once lived here. Then, he found something that made his stomach twist. His own name. Jonathan Whitaker, arrival, October 4th, status, unresolved. His hands trembled. How was his name in a book that looked centuries old? Then, beneath his name, ink began to bleed through the page, forming new words before his eyes. You were warned. Jonathan slammed the book shut, heart pounding. This wasn't possible. Someone was playing a trick on him, had to be. But every rational explanation felt thinner than the air around him. Before he could think, a loud creak echoed through the room. The door, which had been closed when he entered, was now wide open. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but something in that darkness felt wrong. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was an absence of space, of reality itself. And then he heard it. A whisper. No, not a whisper, several voices, overlapping, speaking in words he couldn't understand. The sound grew louder, a rising tide of frantic murmurs. Jonathan took a step back. The moment he did, the voices stopped. Silence. But the door remained open, inviting him. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but something about the silence was worse than the whispers. As if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. Then, a new sound sent ice through his veins. Footsteps. Not from the hallway. From the ceiling. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. The sound moved directly above him, as though someone, or something, was walking upside down. Jonathan's eyes darted upward. The wooden beams above remained still, undisturbed. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the room, pacing methodically. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they halted, right above him. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The air felt suffocating, thick with something unseen. And then, a single drop of liquid fell onto his cheek. Warm. Sticky. He reached up instinctively, his fingers coming away red. Blood. Panic surged through him. He stumbled back, wiping his face, his gaze locked on the ceiling. Nothing. No source for the blood. Just the same, aged wood. But the weight of something unseen still pressed against him. Then, out of the darkness beyond the open door, movement. At first, it was just a shift in the shadows. A trick of the mind. But then he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Deep within the hallway's abyss. Wide. Watching. Unblinking. Jonathan's breath hitched. His body refused to move, every instinct warring between fight and flight. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, the candle in the room extinguished. And the darkness rushed toward him. The moment the candle extinguished, the room was swallowed by darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence. Thick, suffocating, pressing against Jonathan's skin like unseen hands. He fumbled for his flashlight, but when he clicked it on, the beam barely cut through the blackness. It felt unnatural, as if the shadows themselves were devouring the light. Then, from the hallway, the whispering began again. Not frantic like before. Slower. Purposeful. As if whatever lurked in that abyss was speaking directly to him. Jonathan took a step back. The eyes, dozens, maybe hundreds, remained fixed on him. And then, one by one, they blinked out. Not by closing. But by moving. The darkness wasn't just surrounding him. It was alive. Jonathan turned, searching for an escape. His breathing was shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. The only door out of the study was the one leading to the hallway of shadows. But then, something shifted. A second door. He was sure it hadn't been there before, yet now it stood on the opposite side of the room, slightly ajar. Beyond it, a faint glow flickered, like candlelight. It didn't make sense. The manor's layout shouldn't have allowed for another exit. But with the darkness closing in behind him, there was no time to question. He ran toward the door and shoved it open. Instead of another room, a vast, endless void stretched before him. A night sky without stars. An abyss with no bottom. And standing at the edge, facing away from him, was the woman in white. She didn't move. Didn't acknowledge him. But as he stared, something unnatural unfolded. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering. And her shadow, stretching unnaturally long against the floor, was turning toward him. Jonathan staggered back, slamming the door shut. His hands trembled as he braced himself against the wood, his mind struggling to grasp what he had just seen. The silence was deafening. Then, tap, tap, tap. From the other side of the door, something was knocking. Slow. Rhythmic. But the knocks weren't coming from a single place. They moved, first at the center of the door, then lower, then higher, as if whatever was outside was testing its way in. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. And something whispered from the other side. A single word. Soon. Jonathan forced himself to move, to get out of the study. He burst into the hallway, no longer caring about the eyes in the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something metallic, blood, perhaps. As he ran past the portraits, something made him skid to a stop. The woman in white. Her painting was different now. Before, she had been standing with her hands at her sides, staring blankly ahead. Now, she was smiling. And her hand, pressed against the glass of the frame, had left a bloody print. Jonathan's stomach turned. He stumbled backward, but before he could react, a low, guttural sound filled the air. Laughter. Not from the painting. Not from the hallway. It was coming from inside the walls. The laughter faded, but the walls, they weren't still. Jonathan's breath hitched as he saw it. The wallpaper rippled, expanding and contracting like lungs inhaling and exhaling. The wood groaned, shifting as if the entire house was alive, watching him. Then, a whisper, so close it felt like it was spoken directly into his ear. It sees you now. A chill shot down his spine. He turned, ready to bolt. But at the end of the hallway, standing in the doorway to the grand staircase, was the woman in white. No longer a painting. No longer an illusion. She was real. And she was waiting. Jonathan's entire body locked in place. The woman in white stood at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the grand staircase. Her long, tattered dress pooled around her bare feet. The dim light barely illuminated her face, but he could see the unnatural stillness of her form, too rigid, too perfect, as if she weren't entirely part of this world. The air in the corridor thickened, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. Then, she moved. Not with a normal stride. She glided. Her body remained eerily still as she slid forward, closing the distance between them without ever lifting her feet. The sound of fabric dragging against the wooden floor filled the hallway, an unsettling whisper that made his skin crawl. Jonathan took a step back. So did she. His breath hitched. She was mimicking him. He moved left, she mirrored him. He took a cautious step forward, so did she. Then, she tilted her head. A slow, unnatural motion, as if testing him. Jonathan's throat tightened. He had seen enough horror in his career to know one thing. This wasn't a ghost trying to scare him. It was something else. Something that wanted him to play along. Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the pressure in the air shifting, like the house itself was holding its breath. He took another step back. The woman mirrored him again. But then, her head snapped toward the wall beside her. Jonathan flinched. His eyes darted to where she was looking. At first, there was nothing but the peeling wallpaper and the ornate wooden molding. Then, the wall moved. The pattern of the wallpaper twisted, shifting like ink bleeding through paper. Something was beneath it. Jonathan's stomach turned as he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, bulging beneath the wallpaper, straining as if trying to break through. Some were human. Others weren't. And every single one of them was staring at him. The whispering returned. Louder now, overlapping voices hissing in a language he didn't understand. The woman in white slowly turned back toward him. Her lips parted. Not in a scream. But in a smile. Jonathan knew he had to move. Whatever was happening, he couldn't just stand there and wait for it to reach him. He turned sharply and ran. The hallway twisted, impossibly long, as if the house had rearranged itself to keep him trapped inside. The doors lining the corridor blurred past him. He had no idea where he was going, only that he had to get away. Then, the floorboards beneath him shuddered. A sound, deep and unnatural, rumbled through the manor. A slow, rhythmic scraping filled the air, like nails dragging across wood. Jonathan forced himself to look. Something was crawling out from beneath the floorboards. Long, skeletal fingers, too many of them, scratched against the rotting wood, forcing open gaps between the planks. Pale, emaciated arms followed, pulling a distorted body up from the darkness below. Jonathan barely caught a glimpse of its face before his instincts took over. He ran faster. His lungs burned as he sprinted down the endless hallway. Doors blurred past him, each one warped and shifting as if the house itself was coming alive. Then, suddenly, a door to his left burst open. Not by force, but as if it had been waiting for him. Jonathan hesitated only for a second. Then, with the whispers growing louder and the thing behind him scraping its way closer, he threw himself inside. The door slammed shut behind him. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and suffocating. Jonathan reached for his flashlight, his hands shaking. He clicked it on. A bedroom. Unlike the decayed hallways, this room looked untouched. The furniture was pristine, the air smelled faintly of lavender instead of rot. A massive four-poster bed sat against the wall, its silk sheets undisturbed. Then he saw it. A portrait above the fireplace. It was the woman in white. But this time, she wasn't alone. A shadow stood behind her. Not in the painting. In the reflection of the glass. Watching him. Jonathan's breath came in short, ragged bursts. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave, but his legs wouldn't move. The reflection in the portrait, dark, looming, didn't belong to anyone in the painting. It belonged to something standing in the room with him. The candle on the bedside table flickered. The temperature dropped instantly, cold air rushing through the room like an unseen presence exhaling against his skin. Then, fingers. Ice-cold fingers brushed the back of his neck. Jonathan jerked forward, spinning around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. But the mirror beside the bed was fogged, as if something had been breathing against it. And written in the condensation was a single word. Run. Jonathan's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the fogged-up mirror. The word run slowly faded, but the weight of the message lingered. His grip tightened on the flashlight. The room was silent, too silent, as if the entire house was waiting for him to make his next move. He turned toward the door, his instincts screaming at him to get out. But as he reached for the handle, something in the mirror caught his eye. His reflection wasn't right. He was standing still, but the version of him in the mirror had taken a step forward. Jonathan's breath hitched. His reflection lifted its hand, slowly, deliberately, reaching toward the glass. But Jonathan wasn't moving. Then, his reflection smiled. Not his smile. Something else's. His own face twisting into an expression he had never made in his life. And as it pressed against the glass, the surface rippled. Like water. Jonathan stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the door behind him. He wanted to look away, to shut his eyes and pretend he hadn't seen it. But the mirror wouldn't let him. His reflection was still smiling. Then, its hand moved forward, out of the glass. Jonathan barely had time to react. A cold, skeletal hand, identical to his own, burst from the mirror and grabbed his wrist. The grip was wrong. It wasn't just cold. It was empty. Like whatever was holding him wasn't made of flesh and bone, but something hollow, something that had no right to exist in this world. A pressure pulled at him. The mirror was trying to swallow him whole. Jonathan yanked his arm back with all his strength. The thing in the mirror held on tight, its fingers digging into his skin. But then, as suddenly as it had grabbed him, it let go. Jonathan crashed onto the floor. The flashlight rolled out of his grasp, spinning wildly. When he looked up, his reflection was normal again. Except there was something standing behind him. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. His entire body tensed as he felt it. A presence. Something just behind him. It wasn't touching him, but he could feel it. The air was colder, denser. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against the back of his head. Then a whisper. Right next to his ear. Too close. You don't belong here. Jonathan spun around, swinging the flashlight in a wide arc. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing. The room was empty. But the whisper still lingered, curling through his mind like fingers dragging through his thoughts. And then, he saw the door. It was open. Jonathan scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door, which had slammed shut just moments ago, now stood wide open, revealing the hallway beyond. But something was wrong. This wasn't the same hallway he had entered from. The walls were taller, stretching unnaturally high, their surfaces slick and pulsing as if alive. The once decayed wooden floors had turned into something black and wet, like tar, gleaming under the dim candlelight. The air was damp. Heavy. Jonathan hesitated, every instinct screaming at him not to step forward. But staying inside this cursed room wasn't an option either. He placed one foot onto the warped floorboards outside. They groaned beneath him, shifting slightly, as if testing his weight. Then a footstep. Not his own. From the far end of the corridor, something was walking toward him. Slow. Deliberate. And whatever it wasn't human. Jonathan froze. The footsteps echoed, heavy and wet, like bare feet slapping against damp wood. A shadow emerged at the very end of the corridor. Tall, hunched, its limbs too long, its movements jerky, like a puppet being controlled by unseen hands. It stopped. Jonathan's breath was shallow, his chest tightening as the thing tilted its head unnaturally far to the side, its joints popping in sickening cracks. Then, it moved. Not by walking. But by lunging. A single, unnatural twitch of its body sent it skittering halfway down the hallway, too fast, too sudden. Jonathan ran. He didn't care where the hallway led, didn't care if the house twisted itself into a labyrinth to trap him. All he knew was that if that thing caught him, he wouldn't leave this house alive. Jonathan ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning with every step as he sprinted down the impossibly long hallway. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Behind him, the wet, slapping footsteps quickened. The sound was wrong, as if the thing chasing him had more limbs than it should, each one hitting the floor at different intervals. Jonathan didn't dare look back. The hallway twisted, bending in ways that defied logic. Doors blurred past him, some wide open, revealing glimpses of rooms that shouldn't exist, an empty nursery filled with rotting dolls, a ballroom where chandeliers swayed with no wind, a dining hall where a long table sat covered in plates of raw meat. Jonathan clenched his jaw and kept running. Then, the floor tilted. He stumbled, his footing slipping as the wooden planks beneath him slanted downward. The hallway was no longer straight, it was bending into a spiral, pulling him deeper into the manor's impossible architecture. And somewhere in the darkness behind him, the thing laughed. Jonathan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He couldn't outrun this forever. He needed an escape. His eyes darted to the doors as he ran past them. Most were locked, their handles rattling uselessly when he tried them. But then, one door stood slightly ajar. Unlike the others, it wasn't warped or rotten. The wood was pristine, the brass handle gleaming as if untouched by time. Jonathan didn't think, he acted. He lunged forward, shoving the door open and throwing himself inside just as the footsteps behind him reached the threshold. The door slammed shut on its own. Silence. Jonathan pressed his back against the wood, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His flashlight beam shook as he swept it around the room. This wasn't a hallway. It was an office. A grand wooden desk sat in the middle, its surface covered in dust but completely undisturbed. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with old tomes whose spines bore titles in a language he didn't recognize. A fireplace stood cold and unused, and above it, a portrait. Jonathan's stomach dropped. It was a painting of himself. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. He stepped closer to the painting, his breath uneven. It was him, down to the last detail. The same clothes, the same tired expression, even the same cut on his wrist from when he had scraped against the banister earlier. But there was one difference. In the painting, his eyes were missing. Two hollow, black sockets stared back at him. A sudden, sharp scratch filled the room. Jonathan whipped around, flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The sound came again. It wasn't random. Something was writing. Slowly, shakily, letters began to appear on the far wall, carved as if by an invisible hand. Jonathan could only watch as the message completed itself, the deep grooves forming words that made his stomach churn. He is watching. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. Jonathan's fingers twitched around the flashlight. He didn't want to turn around. But he did. And the painting had changed. Now, he was missing from it entirely. Jonathan staggered back, his pulse hammering against his skull. His body screamed for him to leave, to run, to wake up if this was just some fever dream. Then, a noise. Low. Guttural. Coming from inside the fireplace. Jonathan's breath hitched. The hearth had been empty just moments ago, but now, something shifted in the shadows beyond the soot-stained bricks. A figure. No, a shape, something crouching, its form just barely distinguishable in the darkness. It was watching him. The sound of scraping filled the room as it slowly, painfully began to drag itself forward. Jonathan took a step back. The thing took one closer. Then, a hand shot out. Long, bony fingers, pale, stretched, and wrong, slammed against the fireplace's edge, pulling the rest of its body forward. Jonathan barely had time to register the jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light before he made his choice. He turned and ran. Jonathan barreled toward the office door, gripping the handle with all his strength. It didn't budge. Panic surged through his veins. He twisted it, pulled, shoved, nothing. The scratching sound behind him grew louder. Closer. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned his flashlight toward the room again, searching for another way out. And then, he saw it. A second door. One that hadn't been there before. He didn't think, he just ran. The door flung open easily, revealing another corridor. Not the one he had come from, but a new one, impossibly narrow, stretching into darkness. Jonathan didn't care. He sprinted inside, slamming the door shut behind him. For a moment, there was only silence. His own breath, his own pounding heart. Then, a whisper. Right behind him. You shouldn't have come here. Jonathan's body tensed. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything but the whisper that curled through the suffocating darkness. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was right behind him. Slow. Hollow. Dragging with something that felt less like speech and more like a memory of something long dead trying to speak again. Jonathan didn't turn around. He couldn't. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, its walls narrow, pressing in. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something older, something rotten. A cold breath brushed the back of his neck. The darkness behind him moved. Jonathan ran. His flashlight flickered, the weak beam barely illuminating the path ahead. The whispers followed, growing, multiplying. Dozens of voices, overlapping, whispering his name. Then, a new sound. Footsteps. But not just his own. Something was running behind him. Something fast. Something too close. Jonathan's lungs burned as he pushed himself forward. The corridor twisted, turned, every corner leading to another stretch of endless darkness. Then, without warning, the hallway ended. Jonathan skidded to a stop, his boots scraping against the old wooden floor. A wall stood in front of him. No doors. No windows. No way out. He turned, heart pounding. The whispers had stopped. But something was still there. Something in the dark. The footsteps had ceased, but the feeling hadn't. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against him, watching, waiting. Jonathan's flashlight flickered again. For a split second, the dim light caught something, a figure, just at the edge of visibility. Not human. Not alive. It stood motionless, its face obscured by shadow, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Jonathan blinked. And it was closer. Jonathan's body moved before his mind could catch up. His hands shot out, searching the dead-end wall for anything that would let him escape. His fingers met cold stone. Then, something smoother. Wood. A seam. A door. His breath hitched as he shoved against it, his muscles screaming with desperation. The figure in the dark took another step forward, slow and deliberate. The door wouldn't budge. Jonathan's heartbeat pounded in his skull. His palms slammed against the wood again, harder, more frantic. Behind him, something clicked. The air in the corridor shifted. A hand, cold, skeletal, brushed against the back of his neck. The door burst open. Jonathan stumbled forward, falling into the unknown. He landed hard on the wooden floor, pain jolting through his palms and knees. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Silence. Jonathan scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged. The flashlight beam trembled as he swept it across the room. It was different. Unlike the decayed hallways, this place was untouched by time. The walls were lined with antique wallpaper, intricate gold patterns stretching across deep burgundy. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, unlit but perfectly intact. A study. A grand wooden desk sat in the center. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick leather-bound tomes. The air smelled of aged paper and something faintly sweet, like perfume that had lingered for centuries. Jonathan's muscles remained taut. This place was too perfect. His eyes flickered to the desk. A single object rested atop the polished surface. A letter. The paper was crisp, untouched by dust. The handwriting, elegant, deliberate, read only one thing. Welcome home. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The air in the study shifted. Something unseen was here. Watching. The chandelier creaked. A slow, drawn-out sound, as if the room itself was exhaling. Jonathan took a step back. The letter remained on the desk, waiting. Then, a voice. Soft. Gentle. Almost human. You came back, Jonathan. The blood in his veins turned to ice. He had never been here before. Had he? The letter fluttered slightly, as if something had just touched it. Then, the chandelier swung violently. The room plunged into darkness. The light was gone. Jonathan stood frozen in pitch-black silence, his breath shallow. The only sound was the faint creaking of the chandelier as it swayed above him. His flashlight, once his only lifeline, was dead. A cold sensation crawled up his spine, like icy fingers trailing along his skin. The study, so pristine just moments ago, now felt wrong. As if the air itself had shifted into something other, something that could watch, listen, and breathe. Then, a sound. Not from the room. From the letter. A slow, deliberate scratch, like a quill against parchment. Jonathan didn't want to look. But his body disobeyed. His eyes locked onto the desk. The letter was no longer still. The ink was moving. Words formed on their own, the script eerily elegant, as if being written by an unseen hand. "You forgot, didn't you?" Jonathan's chest tightened. Forgot what? The moment the words appeared, something shifted inside Jonathan's mind. A sensation, like a memory trying to surface, clawing its way up from the depths of his consciousness. He saw himself. Standing in this very room. The same desk. The same chandelier. The same letter in his hand. But the Jonathan in the memory wasn't afraid. He was smiling. The image flickered, warping like an old film reel. Then, another scene, Jonathan signing a contract. A figure stood across from him, their face shrouded in darkness. A voice, velvety, calm, whispered something in his ear. Jonathan tried to listen. But the memory shattered. He gasped, staggering backward, his body trembling. This was impossible. He had never been here before. Had he? Jonathan gripped the edge of the desk, his mind spinning. He had to get out. His hands moved instinctively, searching the desk for anything that could give him answers. His fingers brushed against something cool and leather-bound. A book. Its cover was black, unmarked, but the moment his fingertips touched it, a strange pulse ran through his skin. The title burned itself into his mind, though no words were written. The Book of Names. Jonathan didn't open it. But it wanted him to. A deep pressure filled the room, the air growing heavy with expectation. The chandelier swayed again, though there was no wind. The book was waiting. Daring him. Jonathan exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the leather cover. Then. A knock at the door. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The study had no door when he entered. And yet. Knock. Knock. The sound was polite. Rhythmic. As if whoever was on the other side was merely waiting to be invited in. Jonathan's grip on the book tightened. He turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. There it was. A door. Tall, wooden, with a brass handle that gleamed in the dim candlelight. It hadn't been there before. Knock. Knock. This time, the sound was closer. Jonathan took a slow step back. His instincts screamed for him to run, but his body refused to move. Then. The handle turned. Jonathan's entire body tensed. The door creaked open. But there was no one there. Only darkness. A thick, unnatural void, stretching into nothingness. The study's warm candlelight flickered, unable to pierce through the blackness beyond the threshold. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He knew, deep in his bones, that something was standing in that darkness. Watching him. Waiting. Then, a whisper. Soft. Intimate. Right next to his ear. Come back to us. Jonathan staggered back. His pulse roared in his ears. The study trembled, the chandelier rattling violently. The walls breathed, expanding and contracting like living flesh. The book in his hands burned against his skin, its unseen power pressing into his veins. The darkness beyond the door shifted. And then. A hand reached out. Long pale. Too many joints. Fingers stretching toward him, beckoning. Jonathan ran. Jonathan ran. His heart pounded, legs burning as he sprinted through the study. His breath came in ragged gasps, but the panic clawing at his chest kept him moving. Behind him, the door yawned wider. The hand, too long, too wrong, slid forward, reaching, curling. The whisper still echoed in his ears. Come back to us. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the book of names as if it could somehow protect him. He didn't stop to think. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to get out before the thing in the darkness pulled him in. Then, the study changed. Jonathan blinked, his steps faltering. The walls stretched, shifting, bending into something unrecognizable. The bookshelves twisted, warping as if unseen hands were rearranging reality itself. The door was gone. So was the desk. So was the entire study. Jonathan wasn't anywhere anymore. He stood in a hallway. Long, narrow. Wrong. The air was heavy, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. The walls, no longer wooden but stone, breathed, expanding and contracting in slow, unnatural movements. The light was dim, the only illumination coming from an unseen source that cast eerie, shifting shadows. Jonathan turned, pulse hammering. There was no door behind him. No study. No way back. He was trapped. The whispers returned. Soft at first. Distant. Then closer. Dozens of voices, layered over each other, murmuring things he couldn't understand. Some laughed, some sobbed, and some simply breathed. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He had to move. Standing still wasn't an option. Taking a shaky breath, he gripped the book of names and walked forward. The hallway narrowed around him. As Jonathan moved, the whispers followed. The corridor stretched endlessly, each step dragging him deeper into something he didn't understand. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something metallic, like blood. Then, the paintings appeared. They lined the walls, massive, ancient portraits in gilded frames. At first, they seemed like nothing more than old, forgotten relics. Faded oils on cracked canvas. Then Jonathan looked closer. The faces weren't still. The figures inside the paintings moved. Their eyes followed him, their mouths twisting into expressions that changed when he wasn't looking. Some were smiling. Others scowled. One woman with hollow cheeks and ink-black eyes pressed a skeletal hand against the canvas, as if she were trying to get out. Jonathan quickened his pace. The whispers were growing louder. Then, one painting spoke. "Jonathan, why did you come back?" Jonathan froze. The voice was clear. Not a whisper. Not distant. Not in his head. It was real. His breath hitched. Slowly, he turned his gaze to the painting that had spoken. A man stood in the frame. Tall. Thin. Dressed in old-fashioned black attire. His face was obscured, blurred as if time had smeared away his features. But Jonathan could still feel the intensity of his gaze. His shadow stretched out of the painting. Moving toward Jonathan. Jonathan stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold stone wall. The shadow grew, shifting, reaching. "You don't remember, do you?" the voice murmured from the painting. The shadow's fingers brushed his foot. Jonathan bolted. He ran blindly, his lungs burning, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The corridor twisted, the walls breathing, the paintings whispering. Then, a door. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He lunged for it, grabbing the handle and yanking it open. The wood was ice-cold under his fingers, as if it hadn't been touched in centuries. Behind him, the whispers screamed. The shadow was almost upon him. Jonathan threw himself through the doorway. The door slammed shut. For a moment, there was silence. Then, laughter. Not his. Not human. Jonathan turned, his stomach twisting. He was no longer in the castle. He was somewhere worse. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the cold wooden door. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his fingers trembling against the worn leather of the book of names. He turned his head, forcing himself to look. The room was vast. larger than any space should be within the castle walls. The ceiling stretched high, disappearing into darkness. The walls were adorned with decayed tapestries, their faded embroidery depicting scenes of people in agony. Some were chained, others reaching toward an unseen force above them. But the most unsettling thing was the floor. It wasn't made of stone. It was made of bones. Human. Animal. Twisted together in an unholy mosaic, their forms locked in silent suffering. The crunch beneath Jonathan's boot sent a sickening shiver up his spine. A single mirror stood in the center of the room. Tall. Ornate. Wrong. Jonathan didn't want to move toward it. But the room wanted him to. Jonathan swallowed hard, his legs refusing to obey his fear. Something unseen pulled him forward, step by step, until he was standing in front of the mirror. His reflection stared back at him. Except, it wasn't right. His face was there, but the eyes were wrong. Darker. Hollow. The same twisted, ink-black void he had seen in the portraits. His lips curled into a smile he wasn't making. Then, his reflection spoke. "You never left, Jonathan." Jonathan recoiled, his pulse slamming against his ribs. His reflection didn't flinch. It simply stood there, grinning. "Look closer." Jonathan's breath hitched. He didn't want to obey. But his body moved anyway. As he leaned in, the reflection flickered. For a split second, he saw something else. Himself, but older. Dressed in the same black coat as the faceless man in the portrait. Holding the same book of names. The image shifted again. Now, he was inside the mirror, staring out. And the thing in his place was smiling back at him. Jonathan stumbled back, his chest tightening with panic. The mirror shattered. Shards of glass flew through the air, but none of them touched Jonathan. They froze mid-fall, suspended in place, their jagged edges reflecting countless versions of his distorted face. A voice, low, ancient, filled the room. "Jonathan Blackwood. You were warned." The whisper crawled across his skin, colder than the air around him. It slithered into his ears, burrowing deep into his mind. He knew that voice. Even though he had never heard it before. The room shook. The walls breathed. The floor of bones shifted beneath him. Jonathan turned to run. But the door was gone. He was trapped. Pain seared through Jonathan's palm. His fingers curled involuntarily, muscles locking as if something was carving into his skin. He looked down. The book of names was glowing, its leather cover pulsing with an eerie, blood-red light. Symbols, ancient, unreadable, burned into the flesh of his palm, twisting like living ink. The pain was unbearable. But even worse was the knowledge. Jonathan didn't know what the symbols meant. But he understood them. Somewhere deep inside him, buried beneath layers of forgotten memories, he knew exactly what was happening. And he knew it was too late. The mirror was broken. The door was gone. The whispers were rising, swelling into a chorus of laughter and weeping. And Jonathan finally understood. He had been here before. Not just once. Not just recently. He had always been here. Blackwood Castle wasn't just an old estate. It was a prison. A prison for him. The walls closed in. The darkness surged forward. The book of names burned brighter. And Jonathan realized. He had already made his choice. Long, long ago. Jonathan's mind reeled as fragments of memory slammed into him, piece by piece, like shattered glass rearranging itself into something terrible. Blackwood Castle wasn't just a place he had stumbled upon. It was his home. Not just in the sense of ownership or inheritance, he was bound to it. The whispers weren't from strangers. They were his own echoes. Every past version of himself, every cycle, every time he had tried to escape, all of them were here. Trapped in the walls, in the paintings, in the corridors that never ended. And every time, he had forgotten. The castle made sure of it. Jonathan wasn't the first Jonathan Blackwood. He was just the latest. And just like the ones before him, he would never leave. Jonathan staggered, his body heavy with realization. The book of names in his hands pulsed like a heartbeat, syncing with his own. This was the contract. This was why he was here. Long ago, he had made a deal. A desperate, reckless deal with something older than time itself. The castle had given him everything: power, knowledge, eternity. But the price was himself. He had paid it again and again, never remembering, always returning to the beginning, always doomed to relive the same nightmare. His own name was in the book. And as long as it was there, he would never truly die. The laughter in the room swelled. The broken mirror shards trembled, each one reflecting different versions of him, some younger, some older, all staring back with the same haunted realization. There was no escape. Because he was the castle. It had shaped itself around him, fed on him, consumed him until there was nothing left but the cycle. His body stiffened. His breath slowed. The castle was claiming him again. He had played his part. And soon, he would forget. Darkness closed in, wrapping around Jonathan like a shroud. His thoughts blurred. His memories slipped away. He could feel himself fading. The castle whispered to him, soothing, like a mother to a sleeping child. Rest now, Jonathan. It's time to begin again. Somewhere, in a distant part of the castle, a letter was being written. An invitation. To someone new. To someone just like him. The storm raged outside Blackwood Castle. Thunder rolled across the hills, and the rain lashed against the ancient stone walls. A carriage arrived. Its wheels ground against the gravel path as it came to a stop before the towering iron gates. The driver stepped down, shaking off the cold, and pulled a small envelope from his coat. The name was written in elegant, old-fashioned ink. A new name. Another Jonathan Blackwood. And the cycle began again. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.